baking sheets that weren't attached to each other. It sounds really difficult. Hi everybody, it's Katie here, your registered holistic nutritionist and the founder of Live It Well Nutrition Incorporated. Today I'm doing a bit of a different video for you guys. If you don't know, I'm a big fan of a television show that is filmed in Toronto called The Social. On it, they talk about current events, motherhood-related topics, as well as things like style trends and even nutrition. Hey, maybe one day I'll be a guest nutritionist on their show. Who knows? Anyway, one of the show's hosts is named Marcy, and she loves sweets. She's open about that. She clearly states that she's the one rating the jelly beans on office desks, and just last week, she mentioned on the show how she would love to have a calendar with the history of sweets on it. And when I was watching, I was like, what? That's a great idea, Marcy. I'm gonna do that. So, Marcy, I don't know if you'll see this video, but in lieu of Halloween, I've got 5 sweets and their origins coming your way in the next few minutes. If you like this video and would like to see more videos on the history of, say, certain health foods, then hit me up in the comments because I'm game, okay? I'm so game for that. Please consider liking this video as well and subscribing if you're new, and let's get started. First is the history of lollipops, which have gone by many different names over the years and is referred to as sucker here in Canada. Way back in ancient Africa and Asia, Chinese, Arabs, and Egyptians all candied nuts and fruit in honey, honey being the preservative. They inserted sticks into these candied fruit and nut items to make them easier to eat. Makes sense. Later on, it was common for those of higher status to eat sticks of boiled sugar. And when sugar became more available and mainstream in Europe, it was much more common to eat sticks of boiled down sugar for anybody. I remember being a teenager and reading a novel called Little House on the Prairie, which I loved. But it was basically about the early immigrants and pioneers in Canada, and what they did was take a bucket of maple syrup that they had collected, boil it down, and then pour it over snow to flash cool it into candy. Could you imagine all that work and patience for a sucker? I think that's really cool. Okay, cake. Now, Marcy mentioned that she wanted to know about the history of cake as well. So going back to ancient times, the Egyptians were the first culture to really show evidence of baking skills. They made cakes that contained nuts and dried fruit and were sweetened with honey, but they were much more like a bread than a cake. They were very dense. Then, medieval European bakers made fruit cakes and gingerbread that would last for months without going bad. Still, these cakes were nothing like the towers of fondant and buttercream that we see today. In fact, it wasn't until the mid-1600s that cake started to faintly resemble the ones we see today. It was in this era, in Europe, the cakes were made with circular rings that were placed onto flat baking sheets. They weren't attached to each other. It sounds really difficult. Also, sugar was more available by that time, so the cakes were sweeter and lighter, and they were coated for the first time in history with icing, which was basically boiled down sugar and eggs and baked in the oven with the cake midway through its baking cycle. It wasn't quite like sparkly fondant or colorful creamy layers of today's bakers, but it was a glaze that inspired bakers to eventually create iced cakes that we know and call cake today. Brownies. Now, here is a dessert with a complicated history in terms of who gets credit for it. I'll explain. Back in 1893, the chefs at the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago were asked to create a special dessert for the World Columbian Exposition. It had to be easier to eat, and then a piece of pie, and smaller than a slice of cake, because those ladies needed to keep their table manners while also fitting into their corsets. I should actually sit up straighter for this. The result was so good that the hotel still serves this brownie to this day. The thing is that it wasn't called a brownie at the time, even though that's exactly what it was, a brownie. The name brownie wasn't actually coined until 3 years later in 1896, when a woman created a square cookie recipe for her cookbook. Yes, a completely different dessert, and she called it a brownie. This dessert, even though she called it a brownie, contained no chocolate. That's right, no chocolate. That's why a year later, someone else made molasses and chocolate baked cookies, and they borrowed the name brownie, and from that moment on, brownie was then associated with chocolate, and it was forever attached to chocolate. Cotton candy. Okay, this one is pretty funny. Why? Because machine-spun cotton candy was invented in 1897 by, wait for it, an American dentist. Well, it was actually a dentist and a confectioner, but seriously, what a pair. Oh, and it gets better. Years later, in 1921, another machine was invented to make cotton candy by another dentist. This was, I guess, one way to drive business in the dentist field. Later on in the 70s, a bigger, better machine was made for spinning cotton candy, and it was sold more commercially at festivals and things like that. But the actual sweet treat is argued to have originated as spun sugar in Italy as early as the 1400s, but also in Europe in the 1800s. So, who knows? Caramel apples. Our last sweet history is candied apples. And while they were invented nearly 50 years after candied apples, they sure did make a mark in history, didn't they? Believe it or not, it was a Kraft Foods employee who solved the problem of an oversupply of Halloween caramel candies. To solve his issue, he basically just melted all his extra caramels, added the apples into the batch, and the delicious caramel apple was invented. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button so I can have you around for more videos like this. Marcy. If you did happen to watch this, then I hope you liked it too, and I'll be a guest nutritionist on your show anytime. I'll even bring you super healthy brownies that are natural and super sweet, yet sugar-free. I'll surprise you. Until next time, friends, live it well because you only live once. Bye.